"Beautiful view, isn't it?" the tourist asked from the back seat, camera clicking away at the Pacific coastline stretching below them. "Stunning," Jake Morrison replied, keeping his single-engine Cessna steady at 5,500 feet. But he wasn't looking at the scenery his passengers had paid $200 each to see. His eyes were tracking another aircraft, about 3 miles to his left, a twin-engine Beechcraft, flying at what looked like 8,000 feet, heading south along a route that seemed random to anyone else. But Jake Morrison knew it wasn't random. The altitude was wrong. Too low for fuel efficiency, too high for coastal sightseeing. The speed was odd, faster than necessary for leisure flight, slower than optimal for business travel. And the route was exactly what drug smugglers used when they wanted to skirt primary radar coverage while staying in U.S. airspace. Jake made a mental note. Aircraft type, approximate position, heading, time. Filed it alongside 3 other similar observations he'd made in the past month. Different aircraft, same patterns. Same coastal route, same suspicious profiles. The tourists kept snapping photos of mountains and ocean. They had no idea their Scenic tour pilot was building a federal case, one flight at a time. Because Jake Morrison wasn't just a retired pilot offering peaceful tours. He was a former DEA Aviation Operations specialist who'd spent 15 years hunting drug smugglers from the cockpit. And those skills never really retired. Coastal Oregon, where mountains meet the Pacific Ocean in views that draw tourists from around the world. Jake Morrison had been offering scenic flight tours for 5 years, operating out of a small regional airport with one Cessna 172 and a reputation for smooth flights and friendly service. To his customers, Jake was exactly what a scenic tour pilot should be: experienced, safety-conscious, knowledgeable about local geography, and patient with nervous first-time flyers. He'd show them the coastline, point out landmarks, circle around interesting features, and get them back to the airport with good memories and great photos. For 15 years, Jake had flown interdiction missions along the Mexican border, surveillance operations tracking cartel aircraft, insertion flights for undercover agents, and pursuit missions when smugglers tried to run. He'd been shot at twice, had tracked hundreds of suspected trafficking flights, and had provided aerial support for operations that seized tons of narcotics. The work had been intense, dangerous, and meaningful. But after 15 years, Jake had reached his limit. The stress, the danger, the constant exposure to the violence of the drug trade, it had worn him down. When his father passed away and left him some money, Jake had taken early retirement, moved to Oregon, bought a small plane, and started the scenic tour business. It was supposed to be peaceful, relaxing, a way to still fly without the intensity of federal operations. And for the first few years it had been exactly that. Until 6 months ago, when Jake started noticing flight patterns that his trained eye couldn't ignore. It started subtly. Jake would be flying tourists along the coast, and he'd notice another aircraft in the area. Nothing unusual about that. Coastal Oregon had plenty of small aircraft traffic. But some of these planes were flying profiles that triggered Jake's professional instincts. Wrong altitudes for their apparent purpose, routes that avoided populated areas but followed the coastline south. Timing that suggested coordination with ground transportation. Aircraft types that matched known smuggling preferences, twin-engine planes with range and payload capacity. Individually, each observation could be explained away. A pilot choosing a scenic route, flying at an altitude they preferred, heading to a destination that happened to be south. Nothing definitively illegal, but Jake had spent 15 years recognizing patterns in aerial drug trafficking, and these patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. He started keeping detailed logs, not official reports. He had no standing to file those, just personal notes on his observations. Aircraft types, tail numbers when he could read them, altitudes, headings, times, weather conditions. The same kind of surveillance documentation he'd done for DEA, just without the federal backing. DEA wouldn't take him seriously. Local law enforcement had no aviation expertise to evaluate what he was describing. And without official surveillance capabilities, Jake couldn't gather the kind of evidence that would justify opening an investigation. But the pattern was there. Jake's training told him something was happening in the airspace he flew through every day. Drug smugglers were using coastal Oregon as a corridor, and nobody was watching closely enough to see it. The decision point came on a Tuesday afternoon in May. Jake was flying a family of 4 on a sunset tour when he spotted an aircraft that made his instincts scream. Twin-engine Piper Navajo, flying at 7,500 feet on a southbound heading. The altitude put it below primary radar coverage, but high enough for speed. The route followed the coastline, but stayed far enough offshore to avoid most populated areas. And the timing, late afternoon, when light was fading but visibility was still good, was exactly when smugglers preferred to move. Jake watched the Navajo for several minutes, making mental notes while maintaining his tourist flight. Then he saw something that confirmed his suspicions. The Navajo descended rapidly to about 1,000 feet, flew low along the coast for approximately 15 minutes, then climbed back to 7,500 feet and continued south. That low-altitude detour wasn't random. It was a drop or pickup, the kind of maneuver smugglers use to exchange cargo with ground transportation, descending to a predetermined location, making the exchange quickly at low altitude where they're harder to track, then climbing back to cruising altitude. Jake had seen this exact pattern dozens of times during DEA operations. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was drug trafficking, happening in his airspace, while he flew tourists around for photos. That evening, Jake made a call to his former supervisor at DEA Aviation Operations, Tom Chen. They'd flown together for 8 years, and Tom knew Jake's capabilities. "Tom, I need to talk to you about something I've been seeing in Oregon airspace." "Jake Morrison, been a while. What are you seeing?" "Smuggling patterns. Multiple aircraft over several months, all following similar profiles. I've been documenting everything." There was a pause. "You're retired, Jake. You're not supposed to—" The decision point came on a Tuesday afternoon in May. Jake was flying a family of 4 on a sunset tour when he spotted an aircraft that made his instincts scream. Twin-engine Piper Navajo, flying at 7,500 feet on a southbound heading. The altitude put it below primary radar coverage, but high enough for speed. The route followed the coastline, but stayed far enough offshore to avoid most populated areas. And the timing, late afternoon, when light was fading but visibility was still good, was exactly when smugglers preferred to move. Jake watched the Navajo for several minutes, making mental notes while maintaining his tourist flight. Then he saw something that confirmed his suspicions. The Navajo descended rapidly to about 1,000 feet, flew low along the coast for approximately 15 minutes, then climbed back to 7,500 feet and continued south. That low-altitude detour wasn't random. It was a drop or pickup, the kind of maneuver smugglers use to exchange cargo with ground transportation, descending to a predetermined location, making the exchange quickly at low altitude where they're harder to track, then climbing back to cruising altitude. Jake had seen this exact pattern dozens of times during DEA operations. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was drug trafficking, happening in his airspace while he flew tourists around for photos. That evening, Jake made a call to his former supervisor at DEA Aviation Operations, Tom Chen. They'd flown together for 8 years, and Tom knew Jake's capabilities. "Tom, I need to talk to you about something I've been seeing in Oregon airspace." "Jake Morrison, been a while. What are you seeing?" "Smuggling patterns. Multiple aircraft over several months, all following similar profiles. I've been documenting everything." There was a pause. "You're retired, Jake. You're not supposed to be conducting surveillance." "I'm not conducting surveillance. I'm flying scenic tours and happening to notice aircraft that display characteristics I learned to recognize during 15 years with DEA." "What kind of characteristics?" Jake walked Tom through his observations. The altitudes, routes, timing, aircraft types, and that afternoon's low-altitude maneuver that suggested an active drop. Tom listened carefully. "Jake, if this is what you think it is, we need official assets." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Officially, I can't ask a civilian to conduct surveillance operations. Unofficially, if a concerned citizen with aviation expertise happened to document suspicious activity and reported it to authorities, we'd have to evaluate that information." Jake became a spy, hiding in plain sight. Every tourist flight became a surveillance mission. He'd fly his regular routes, point out scenery, answer questions about local geography, all while maintaining constant awareness of other aircraft in his airspace. He invested in better equipment, a high-quality camera with telephoto lens that tourists assumed was for taking photos of whales and wildlife, a GPS logger that recorded his exact position and time, allowing him to document where and when he observed suspicious aircraft, a digital recorder for verbal notes he'd make immediately after flights. His documentation became methodical, professional, exactly the kind of surveillance logs he'd kept during DEA operations. Aircraft descriptions, tail numbers, flight profiles, weather conditions, nearby landmarks. Everything that would help investigators confirm his observations and build cases. Over 3 months, Jake's surveillance revealed a sophisticated operation. Multiple aircraft were using coastal Oregon as a smuggling corridor. They'd fly down from Washington or up from California, following routes that avoided radar coverage and populated areas. Some were making drops or pickups along the coast. Others were probably just transiting through, moving product between larger distribution points. The operation was careful, professional, and nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. But Jake was looking, with 15 years of expertise guiding his observations. He documented 17 flights that matched smuggling profiles. He identified 2 probable landing zones where aircraft made low-altitude maneuvers suggesting cargo exchange. He even spotted pattern timing. Most flights happened on weekends, probably because ground transportation could move more freely when routine traffic was higher. Jake wasn't conducting a federal investigation. He was just a scenic tour pilot who happened to have extraordinary training in aerial drug trafficking patterns. And he was building a case that DEA couldn't ignore. Within 6 weeks, DEA had enough evidence to justify full interdiction operations. Jake's patterns were accurate. Multiple aircraft were using coastal Oregon for drug trafficking, moving cocaine and methamphetamine between distribution points in Seattle, Portland, and California. The takedown involved coordinated operations across 3 states. DEA aviation units, local law enforcement, Coast Guard assets, and federal prosecutors working together to dismantle a trafficking network that had moved millions of dollars in narcotics through routes that seemed too small and remote for serious attention. 12 arrests, 7 aircraft seized, significant quantities of drugs intercepted. And at the center of it all, evidence that started with a retired DEA pilot who'd been flying tourists around for pretty views. Jake testified at several trials, explaining the flight patterns that had revealed the operation. Defense attorneys tried to dismiss him as a civilian without authority. Prosecutors pointed out his 15 years of DEA aviation operations experience and his expert recognition of smuggling indicators. The convictions held. The trafficking network was dismantled, and coastal Oregon became a harder route for drug smugglers, with increased awareness and surveillance. Jake Morrison still flies scenic tours along the Oregon coast, still shows tourists beautiful views, points out whales, circles around interesting landmarks. But now, DEA knows he's there, watching, documenting, recognizing patterns that others miss. He's on call as a consultant when aerial trafficking patterns emerge. He trains other pilots on what to look for when flight profiles seem suspicious. And he continues providing evidence that supports interdiction operations across the Pacific Northwest. The tourists still think he's just a friendly pilot, offering peaceful flights. They have no idea they're flying with one of the most experienced aerial drug trafficking observers in federal law enforcement history. "Do you ever miss the intensity of DEA operations?" Tom Chen asked during one consultation. "Every day," Jake replied, "but this works better. I can still use